Every parent's worst nightmare is abandoning their child. Yet in 1887 Silver Creek, one father did exactly that. 8-year-old Clara stood on the auction block, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face, while her drunken father sold her like livestock to pay his debts. The crowd of ranchers and townspeople looked away in shame. Nobody wanted to bid on a frightened little girl clutching her only possession, a ragged cloth doll. Her father stumbled away with his coins, leaving Clara alone on that wooden platform under the scorching Arizona sun. The auctioneer was about to send her to the orphanage when something unexpected happened. From the shadows stepped Takoda, an Apache warrior who had lost everything in the Indian Wars. He pulled out his last silver piece and made a bid that shocked the entire town. What would an Apache want with a white settler's child? Could these two broken souls find healing together in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Creek's dusty Main Street, but Clara Mackenzie had learned to fear the light. Light meant her father would wake, and when he woke, the bottles would come out again. She pressed herself against the corner of their ramshackle cabin, watching through a crack in the weathered boards as he stirred on the floor where he'd collapsed the night before. "Clara," he slurred, his voice thick with the remnants of last night's whiskey. "Girl, where'd you put my money?" She knew better than to answer. There was no money left. There hadn't been for weeks, not since he'd sold her mother's wedding ring, her mother's china, even her mother's Bible. Everything that had once made their house a home now lived in other people's houses or had been traded for amber liquid that made her father forget he had a daughter who needed feeding. Clara clutched her doll closer to her chest. The fabric was so worn that the original blue dress had faded to gray, and one button eye hung by a single thread. But it was the last thing her mother had sewn before the fever took her 2 winters ago, and Clara would rather starve than let her father sell it too. "I know you're hiding money from me," her father continued, struggling to his feet. The floorboards creaked ominously under his weight. Once, he'd been a proud man who worked the silver mines with steady hands and came home each evening to lift Clara high in the air. That man had died with her mother. What remained was a hollow shell that looked like her father, but spoke with the voice of his demons. Outside, the town of Silver Creek was coming to life. Clara could hear the familiar sounds drifting through their thin walls. Mrs. Henderson calling to her chickens, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against his anvil, children laughing as they ran toward the schoolhouse. Normal sounds of normal families living normal lives. Clara pressed her face to the window and watched other children her age walking hand in hand with their mothers, carrying lunch pails and books. She'd attended school for 3 weeks after her mother died, but then the teacher stopped sending notes home about missed days and unpaid fees. Silver Creek had grown from nothing when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains 15 years ago. Now it boasted 2 saloons, a general store, a church, and nearly 300 souls who called it home. Most were decent folks trying to carve out honest livings from unforgiving land. But like any frontier town, it also attracted those running from something or someone. Men like her father, who'd arrived 5 years ago with a pregnant wife, wild dreams, and skills that evaporated the moment tragedy struck. The Apache situation added another layer of tension to daily life. The Chiricahua and other bands had been fighting the government's relocation efforts for decades, and every few months brought news of skirmishes, raids, or cavalry movements through the territory. Most townspeople had never seen an Apache up close, but fear and stories shaped their opinions nonetheless. They were the boogeyman parents used to keep children close to home after dark, the excuse men gave for carrying extra ammunition, the reason women crossed themselves when the wind howled through the mountains at night. What the townspeople didn't know was that one Apache warrior had been watching their town for weeks. Takoda, crouched behind a cluster of palo verde trees on the ridge overlooking Silver Creek, his dark eyes studying the settlement below. He'd been tracking a wounded deer for 3 days, following its blood trail down from the higher elevations when he'd first discovered this place. The deer had died 2 miles north, providing meat for his solitary camp. But something about the town had drawn him back repeatedly. Perhaps it was the familiarity of the suffering he sensed here. Towns like this one dotted the territory now, filled with people who'd lost their way just as surely as his own people had been driven from theirs. White settlers called it progress, but Takoda saw the same hollow eyes in these farmers and miners that he'd seen in Apache faces at San Carlos Reservation. The look of people disconnected from everything that had once given their lives meaning. He reached unconsciously for the medicine pouch at his side, fingers tracing the soft leather that held all he had left of his former life. Inside were 3 items: a piece of turquoise his wife had worn on their wedding day, a small braid of his daughter's hair, and a white shell that had belonged to his mother. These were his anchors to a world that no longer existed, talismans of love that had been ripped away by violence and forced relocation. Takoda had been a family man once, before the soldiers came. He'd lived peacefully in the Drunken mountains with his wife Itzel and their 6-year-old daughter Ayana. Their wickiup had sat in a sheltered canyon where clear water ran year-round and oak trees provided acorns for winter storage. Itzel had been known throughout their band for her skill with medicinal plants, and little Ayana had inherited her mother's gift for healing along with her father's quick mind. They'd been gathering roots for winter medicine when the cavalry attacked their camp. Takoda had been 5 miles away, hunting elk with his brother-in-law, when they heard the gunfire echoing through the canyons. By the time they returned, everything was smoke and blood and silence. Itzel and Ayana lay together beside their overturned, grinding stone, their hands still clasped as if they'd been trying to protect each other when the bullets found them. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Takoda had lived alone in the high country, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. He took what he needed from the land and avoided contact with both his own people and the whites who'd destroyed his world. The Apache bands that remained free considered him touched by grief spirits, while the reservation Apache thought him foolish for refusing the safety of surrender. He existed in the space between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but something about this particular town called to him, and he'd spent enough years listening to his instincts to pay attention when they spoke. So he returned each morning to his watching place, studying the people below, trying to understand what drew him here. He'd noticed a little girl immediately. She was too thin, and her clothes hung loose on her small frame. While other children played and laughed, she moved like a shadow, always watching, always careful. Takoda recognized the wariness in her posture, the way she startled at sudden sounds and seemed to make herself smaller when adults approached. He'd seen the same behavior in Apache children who'd witnessed too, much violence too young, but it was more than simple neglect that caught his attention. The child carried herself with a dignity that reminded him of his own daughter head up, despite her circumstances, back straight, despite the weight she shouldn't have to bear. And she protected that ragged doll with the same fierce devotion Ayana had shown for her own treasured possessions. Takoda had been watching the morning when her father dragged her from their cabin and forced her down the main street toward the town center. Even from his distant vantage point, he could see her terror, could read the resignation in her small shoulders. By the time he understood what was happening and made his way closer to town, a crowd had already gathered around the Pantane makeshift auction platform he'd hidden in the alley beside the general store, close enough now to see the tears on the child's face, close enough to hear her father's slurred speech as he explained to the auctioneer why his daughter needed to be sold. The man reeked of whiskey even from 20 feet away, and his hands shook with the tremors of long addiction. The crowd's discomfort was palpable. These were decent people who'd never expected to witness something so fundamentally wrong in their town square. Women clutched their own children closer while men shifted from foot to foot, unsure whether intervention would make things worse. The sheriff stood to one side, clearly conflicted about the legality of what was happening, but unwilling to act without clearer grounds. "Starting bid is $5, the auctioneer announced reluctantly, "for domestic work and such training as the buyer sees fit." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. No one wanted to participate in this horror, but no one seemed to know how to stop it either. That's when Takoda made his decision. He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew the silver trade coin. He'd been saving his last valuable possession, worth nearly a month's wages to most men in this town. It was meant to buy winter supplies from the Mexican traders who sometimes ventured into Apache country. But suddenly, he knew it had a different purpose. The child on the platform looked so much like Ayana that his chest tightened with old grief. But beneath the familiar ache, something else stirred, something that felt almost like hope. Perhaps the spirits had guided him here for a reason. Perhaps two broken souls could help heal each other's wounds. Takoda stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the crowd, the silver coin warm in his palm. The crowd parted like wheat before wind as Takoda emerged from the alley. Conversations died mid-sentence. Hands moved instinctively toward gun belts. Mothers pulled their children behind their skirts, and men stepped forward protectively, creating a barrier between their families and the approaching Apache. Takoda had expected this reaction. In their eyes, he was everything they'd been taught to fear: a savage from the mountains, a threat to their carefully constructed civilization. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his buckskin clothing marked him immediately as Apache. The knife at his belt and the rifle across his back only confirmed their worst assumptions about his intentions. But he kept walking steadily toward the auction platform, his moccasined feet silent on the hard-packed earth. His face remained calm and composed, showing none of the grief or determination that churned beneath the surface. Years of hunting had taught him that sudden movements frighten prey, and these people were very much afraid. Clara watched him approach with wide, terrified eyes. She'd heard the stories the other children whispered, tales of Apache warriors who stole white children in the night, who could move through the forest like ghosts, who drank the blood of their enemies. Her father had told her such stories too, usually when he was drunk and wanted to frighten her into obedience. Now one of those mythical figures was walking straight toward her, and she was trapped on this platform with nowhere to run. Takoda stopped at the edge of the crowd and reached slowly into his medicine pouch. Every man in the square tensed, ready to draw their weapons, but instead of a knife or tomahawk, he withdrew a single silver coin. He held it up so the light caught its surface, then stepped forward and placed it deliberately on the auctioneer's table. "I bid for the child," he said in careful English, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. The auctioneer's mouth fell open. Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "Now hold on there," he said, trying to project authority while clearly uncertain of his legal ground. "This here's a civilized proceeding, and I don't think— Is his money not good?" interrupted a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Dr. James Whitmore, the town's physician, stepping forward. He was an elderly man with kind eyes who delivered half the children in Silver Creek, and his opinion carried weight with the townspeople. "The law says any man can bid at a public auction, Sheriff. I don't see where it specifies the bidders." "Race." Sheriff Morrison's face reddened. "But Doc, you can't seriously think—" "I think," Dr. Whitmore said quietly, "that someone needs to get that child off that platform before this becomes something we'll all regret witnessing." If this man has a legal tender and means the girl no harm, perhaps we should consider his offer. Means her no harm? Spat a voice from the crowd. He's Apache. They take scalps. As do some white men I've known, Dr. Whitmore replied pointedly. Judge a man by his actions, not his blood. Clara's father swayed forward, his eyes fixed greedily on the silver coin. How much is it worth? He slurred to the auctioneer. The auctioneer picked up the coin with trembling fingers, examining it closely. It's a Spanish piece of 8. He announced. Worth about $20, I'd say. A murmur ran through the crowd. $20 was more money than most of them saw in a month. Clara's father's eyes lit up with avarice, and he nodded eagerly at the auctioneer. Sold, he declared before anyone could object. $20 to the Indian. Father, no. Clara's voice broke as she finally found her tongue. Please don't sell me. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. But her father was already reaching for the coin, his hands shaking with anticipation of his next drink. The betrayal cut through Clara like a physical blow. She'd known he didn't love her anymore, but she'd never imagined he could simply throw her away for money. Sheriff Morrison stepped closer to Takoda, his jaw set grimly. Apache, I'm going to need to know your intentions with this child. We've got laws about it. I will not harm her, Takoda said simply. She will be fed. She will be safe. She will be treated with honor. That's not good enough, Morrison replied. You can't just take a white child into Apache country. There are procedures, legal guardianship papers. The sale is legal, Doctor. Whitmore interrupted again. I heard the auctioneer declare it completed. Unless you have evidence of criminal intent, Sheriff, I believe the transaction stands. Morrison looked around the crowd, clearly hoping for support, but found only uncomfortable faces and averted eyes. No one wanted to be responsible for what happened next, but no one seemed willing to intervene either. The situation had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control it gracefully. Takoda walked slowly toward the platform where Clara cowered. She pressed herself against the wooden post, clutching her doll so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When he reached the edge of the platform, he stopped and held out his hand to her. Come, he said gently. No one will hurt you now. Clara stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a serpent. This was at the moment her life changed forever. Behind her, she could hear her father counting coins with the auctioneer, already planning his celebration. Around her, the townspeople watched like spectators at a tragic play, interested but unwilling to participate. I won't go, she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Where else could she go? Her father had made it clear she was unwanted. The townspeople had made it equally clear they wouldn't intervene on her behalf. Takoda remained patient, his hand still extended. You have something that belongs to you, he observed. Nodding toward her doll Dot, Clara looked down at the ragged toy. In her arms. It was indeed hers, the only thing in the world that truly belonged to her now. My mama made her, she said quietly. Then she's precious, Takoda replied. What is her name? The question caught Clara off guard. No one had ever asked about her doll before. Her father certainly never had. Hope, she whispered. Her name is Hope. Something flickered in Takoda's dark eyes, pain, perhaps, or recognition. Hope is a good name, he said. Will you bring Hope with us? The way he included the doll in his invitation, the respect he showed for something that mattered to her, pierced through Clara's terror just enough to let curiosity take root. Maybe, just maybe, this stranger wouldn't be cruel to her. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and placed her small hand in his much larger one. His skin was warm and calloused from hard work, but his grip was gentle as he helped her down from the platform. The crowd watched in tense silence as the unlikely pair walked toward the edge of town. Clara's short legs working hard to keep up with Takoda's longer stride. As they passed her father, who was still examining his coins, Clara stopped. "Father?" she called softly. He looked up, already struggling to focus his whiskey-dulled eyes. "Goodbye," she said simply. He blinked at her as if trying to remember who she was, then turned back to his money without a word. Dr. Whitmore watched them go with a heavy heart, wondering if he'd just participated in saving a child or destroying one. Sheriff Morrison stood with his hand still on his gun, clearly debating whether to follow them or let sleeping dogs lie. At the very edge of Silver Creek, just before the road curved into the desert, Clara's doll slipped from her nervous fingers and fell to the ground. She stopped immediately, pulling against Takoda's hand as she tried to retrieve it. Without hesitation, Takoda bent down and picked up the small toy, dusting it off carefully before handing it back to her. "Hold tight to what matters," he said quietly. "The journey ahead is long." Clara took her doll and looked up into his face, searching for some sign of his intentions. What she saw there wasn't the savage cruelty she'd been taught to expect, but something else entirely, a deep sadness that seemed to match her own. For the first time since her mother died, Clara felt a tiny spark of something she'd almost forgotten. The possibility that someone might actually care what happened to her. Behind them, Silver Creek continued its daily business, but the story of the Apache who bought the unwanted child would be told and retold for years to come. Some would call it a tragedy, others a miracle. But for Clara and Takoda, it was simply the beginning of a journey that would transform them both in ways neither could imagine. As they walked into the vast Arizona wilderness, Clara held hope tighter than ever, whispering silent prayers to her mother's memory and wondering what lay ahead in the mysterious world beyond the mountains. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of red earth and thorn plants beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Clara had never been more than a mile from Silver Creek in her entire life, and now each step carried her further into a world that seemed as alien as the moon. Takoda's horse, a sturdy paint marais named Ciala, followed behind them with patient resignation. Clara had expected they would ride, but Takoda seemed content to walk, setting a steady pace that her short legs could manage. Every few minutes, he would glance back to check on her, but he didn't speak unless she asked a direct question. The silence felt heavy at first. Clara was used to noise her father's drunken ramblings, the sounds of the town, the familiar creaks and groans of their cabin. Out here, the only sounds were their footsteps, the occasional call of a hawk overhead, and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. But gradually, the quiet began to feel less threatening and more peaceful. There was something soothing about the rhythm of walking, about having a clear path ahead, even if she didn't know where it led. For the first time in months, Clara wasn't afraid of sudden violence or angry shouting. Whatever else this Apache warrior might be, he wasn't drunk, and he wasn't taking his pain out on her. When the sun reached its peak and the heat became overwhelming, Takoda led them to a cluster of rocks that provided blessed shade. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a water bladder and offered it to Clara first. The water was warm but clean, and she drank gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered, using the manners her mother had taught her. Takoda nodded and took a drink himself before offering her strips of dried meat from a leather pouch. Clara hesitated. She'd heard stories about Apache food, none of them appetizing, but hunger won over fear. The meat was tougher than anything she was used to, but it had a smoky flavor that wasn't unpleasant, and it filled the empty ache in her stomach better than anything she'd eaten in weeks. "Is it deer?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Takoda replied. "I hunted it 3 days ago." Clara studied his face as he spoke. His English was careful and precise, with an accent that made the words sound different but not unpleasant. She'd expected grunts and broken phrases, but he spoke more clearly than many of the Myers back in Silver Creek. "Where are we going?" she asked, the question that had been building since they left town. "To my people," Takoda said. "In the mountains." Are there others like you? Something flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps. There are others who are Apache, yes. But none like me. Clara didn't understand what he meant by that, but she didn't ask for clarification. Instead, she found herself studying his hands as he repacked their food. They were strong and weathered, with scars that spoke of hard living, but they moved gently around the supplies. When he picked up her doll earlier, those same hands had been careful not to damage the fragile fabric dot as they prepared to resume walking. Takoda pulled a woven blanket from his saddlebags. Without explanation, he draped it around Clara's shoulders, protecting her pale skin from the relentless sun. "It's too big," Clara said, swimming in the oversized covering. "You'll grow into it," Takoda replied, and something in his tone suggested he meant more than just her physical size. The blanket was unlike anything Clara had ever felt. The wool was soft and thick, woven in patterns of brown and red and yellow that seemed to tell a story she couldn't read. It smelled faintly of sage smoke and something else, something that reminded her of safety, though she couldn't say why. As they walked through the afternoon heat, Clara found herself stealing glances at her unlikely protector. He moved through the desert like he belonged here, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her. Occasionally, he would pause to examine tracks in the sand or study the flight pattern of birds overhead, gathering information from a world she'd never learned to see. "How do you know which way to go?" she asked during one of these stops. Takoda pointed to a distant peak, barely visible through the heat shimmer. "That mountain is sacred to my people. It calls us home." Clara squinted at the far-off summit, seeing nothing but rock and sky. "It doesn't call to me, because you haven't learned to listen yet," Takoda said. "But you will." As the day wore on, Clara's exhaustion began to show. She'd been running on fear and adrenaline since the auction, but now her small body was demanding rest. Her steps grew shorter and more unsteady, and twice she stumbled over rocks she should have seen. Takoda noticed immediately. Without discussion, he lifted Clara onto Siala's back, settling her behind the saddle where she could hold on securely. The horse's gait was smooth and rhythmic, and the warmth of the animal's body was comforting. Clara's eyelids grew heavy, despite her efforts to stay alert. "Sleep," Takoda said simply. "I will watch over you." Clara wanted to resist. She'd learned the hard way that sleep could be dangerous when adults were drinking or angry, but something in his voice convinced her. He'd said he would watch over her, and for reasons she couldn't explain. She believed him. She dozed fitfully as they traveled, waking occasionally when Siala stepped over rough ground or when a bird cried overhead. Each time she stirred, Takoda was there beside her, steady and vigilant. Once, when she startled awake from a nightmare about her father, she found Takoda walking with one hand resting lightly on her ankle, not restraining her, but letting her know she wasn't alone. When evening painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Takoda led them to a sheltered spot between two large boulders. A small seep provided fresh water, and the rocks would hide their fire from any watchers. He helped Clara down from the horse with the same gentle care he'd shown all day. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Clara nodded, suddenly aware that her stomach was cramping with emptiness. Takoda built a small fire with practiced efficiency, then prepared a simple meal of roasted pine nuts and more dried meat. To Clara's surprise, he also produced a small cake made from ground acorns and wild berries. He began, then stopped abruptly. "Someone taught me to make these," he finished quietly. Clara bit into the cake and smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since her mother's death. It was sweet and nutty, with a texture unlike anything she'd ever tasted. "It's wonderful," she said honestly. Takoda watched her eat with an expression she couldn't read. There was sadness there, but also something else. Perhaps hope. As the fire burned down to coals and the desert night began its transformation from furnace to icebox, Takoda arranged Clara's bedroll close to the dying warmth. He gave her an extra blanket and showed her how to wrap herself so the heat wouldn't escape. "Aren't you cold?" Clara asked, noticing that he planned to sleep with only his horse blanket for warmth. "I'm used to it," Takoda replied. Clara hesitated, then held out one corner of her extra blanket. "Mama always said sharing makes everything warmer." For a long moment, Takoda simply stared at her outstretched hand. Then, slowly, he moved closer and accepted the offered warmth. They lay beside the cooling coals, not quite touching, but sharing the same small space, the same fragile heat. "Takoda?" Clara whispered into the darkness. "Yes, thank you for buying me, even if I don't know why you did it." A long silence followed. When Takoda finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Clara had to strain to hear it. "Sometimes the spirits, the people in our path for reasons we don't understand until much later. Perhaps you were meant to be here. Perhaps I was meant to find you." Clara didn't understand what he meant about spirits, but she understood kindness when she felt it. For the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep feeling safe, wrapped in warmth that came from more than just blankets. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing the beginning of a bond that would change both their lives forever. On their third morning of travel, Clara woke to the sound of voices speaking in a language that flowed like water over stones. She sat up quickly, clutching hope to her chest, and saw Takoda speaking with 2 Apache men who had appeared as silently as morning mist. The men were dressed similarly to Takoda in buckskin and woven cloth, their long hair decorated with feathers and small bones. They carried bows and rifles with easy familiarity, and their eyes held the same watchful quality she'd noticed in Takoda. But where Takoda's face showed patience when he looked at her, these men's expressions revealed only suspicion. They spoke rapidly in Apache, their voices rising and falling in what sounded like an argument. Clara caught the way they gestured toward her, and she didn't need to understand their words to know she was the subject of their debate. What are they saying? She whispered when Takoda returned to her side. "They're surprised to see you," Takoda said carefully. "They want to know why I bring a white child to our camp." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That you needed a family, and I needed." He paused, searching for words. "I told them the spirits guided us together." One of the Apache men called out again, his tone sharper now. Takoda responded in the same language, his voice firm but respectful. Finally, the men nodded reluctantly and melted back into the landscape, as quietly as they'd appeared. "They will tell the others we're coming," Takoda explained. "The camp will be ready for us." Clara wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed dramatically. The harsh desert gave way to slopes covered with oak trees and manzanita bushes. Clear streams trickled down rocky channels, and the air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. It was beautiful in a way that made Clara's chest feel tight with unnamed emotion. "It looks like where stories happen," she said softly. Takoda glanced at her with something like approval. "What kind of stories?" "The kind where magic is real," Clara replied, then blushed at her fanciful words. "All magic is real if you know how to see it," Takoda said seriously. "My people will teach you to see." They rounded a bend in the trail, and suddenly Clara could see the Apache camp spread out in a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside. Wikiup's dome-shaped structures made from bent poles and woven grass dotted the landscape like brown mushrooms. Cook fires sent thin streams of smoke into the clear air, and she could see people moving between the dwellings with purposeful activity. It was nothing like Silver Creek. There were no straight lines or right angles, no buildings that imposed themselves harshly on the landscape. Instead, the camp seemed to grow naturally from the mountain itself, as if it had always been there. As they descended into the camp, people stopped their activities to stare. Clara had never felt so conspicuous in her life. Her pale skin and light brown hair marked her immediately as an outsider, and her ragged dress and worn shoes announced her poverty to anyone who cared to look. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. Women paused in their grinding of corn and preparation of food to watch the strange procession. Men emerged from wickiups with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. That an elderly woman approached them, her back straight despite her obvious age, and her silver hair braided with turquoise beads. She looked Clara up and down, with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, then spoke rapidly to Takoda in Apache. "This is Grandmother Nayeli," Takoda told Clara. "She leads the women of our camp. She wants to know if you're hungry." Clara nodded shyly, overwhelmed by the attention and unsure of the proper etiquette. Grandmother Nayeli smiled the first friendly expression Clara had seen since entering the camp and gestured for them to follow her. The old woman's wickiup was larger than most of the others, with intricate patterns woven into its grass walls. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious and comfortable. Woven mats covered the floor, and baskets of various sizes held food, clothing, and mysterious objects Clara couldn't identify. A small fire burned in the center, its smoke escaping through an opening in the roof. Grandmother Nayeli ladled stew from a clay pot into a wooden bowl and handed it to Clara with gestures that needed no translation. The stew contained chunks of meat and vegetables Clara didn't recognize, but it was warm and filling and seasoned with herbs that made her mouth water. While Clara ate, Takoda and Grandmother Nayeli spoke in low voices. Clara caught the rhythm of their conversation, question and answer, explanation and response, but understood none of the words. She did notice that Grandmother Nayeli's expression softened as Takoda spoke, and several times the old woman looked at Clara with something that might have been pity or understanding. Other women began arriving at the wickiup, drawn by curiosity about the white child in their midst. They spoke in quick bursts of Apache, their voices rising with excitement or concern. Clara felt like an exotic animal being discussed by its potential keepers. Finally, Grandmother Nayeli clapped her hands sharply, and the other women fell silent. She spoke with obvious authority, and Clara caught the tone of someone making a decision that wasn't open for debate. The other women nodded reluctantly and began to disperse. "What did she say?" Clara asked Takoda. "She said you will stay with her until you learn our ways," he replied. "She will teach you to be Apache. But what about you?" Clara felt a stab of panic at the thought of being separated from the one familiar person in this strange place. "I will be nearby," Takoda assured her. "But Grandmother Nayeli is wise in the ways of women. She will teach you things I cannot." Before Clara could protest further, Grandmother Nayeli was pulling her to her feet and leading her to a corner of the wickiup where a pile of folded clothing waited. With gentle but insistent gestures, she indicated that Clara should remove her worn dress and put on the Apache garments instead. The clothes were unlike anything Clara had ever worn. The skirt was made of soft doeskin decorated with beads and small metal ornaments that tinkled when she moved. The blouse was woven from plant fibers in patterns of brown and yellow, and it felt cool and comfortable against her skin. Grandmother Nayeli helped her with the unfamiliar fastenings, her old hands surprisingly gentle. When Clara was dressed, the old woman led her to a polished metal mirror, clearly a trade item from the white world, and gestured for her to look at herself. Clara gasped. The girl in the mirror looked like someone else entirely, someone who belonged in this mountain camp rather than the dusty streets of Silver Creek. "Pretty," Grandmother Nayeli said in careful English, one of the few words she knew in Clara's language. She smiled and patted Clara's cheek with approval. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Clara sat beside Grandmother Nayeli's fire and watched the camp come alive with activity. Families gathered around their own fires for the evening meal, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. It was so different from the tense silence that had dominated her life in Silver Creek. Takoda appeared at the entrance to the wickiup, carrying something wrapped in soft leather. He knelt beside Clara and unwrapped his gift, a pair of moccasins made from supple hide and decorated with tiny blue beads. "For walking the mountain paths," he said, as he helped her slip them onto her feet. "Your other shoes will not serve you. Here, the moccasins fit perfectly, as if they'd been made specifically for her feet." Clara wiggled her toes, marveling at how the soft leather moved with her like a second skin. "Did you make these?" she asked. "Grandmother Nayeli made them," Takoda replied. "She worked on them while we traveled here." Clara looked at the old woman with new understanding. Somehow, Grandmother Nayeli had known exactly what size to make the moccasins without ever measuring Clara's feet. It was as if she'd simply looked at her and understood what she would need. "Thank you," Clara said to Grandmother Nayeli, trying to put all her gratitude into the words, even though she knew the woman probably didn't understand English. But Grandmother Nayeli smiled and nodded, and Clara realized that some things needed no translation. As darkness settled over the camp, Takoda rose to leave. "I will build my wickiup nearby," he told Clara. "If you need anything, call for me." "Don't go," Clara said quickly, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. "I mean, please stay a little longer." Takoda settled back down beside the fire. "What troubles you?" "Everything," Clara admitted. "I don't understand anything here. The language, the customs, even the food is different. What if I can't learn? What if I don't belong here any more than I belonged in Silver Creek?" Grandmother Nayeli, who had been quietly listening to their English conversation, reached into one of her baskets and withdrew something small and round. She placed it in Clara's palm, a smooth stone the color of autumn leaves, worn smooth by countless hands. "Grinding stone," Takoda translated as Grandmother Nayeli spoke. "She says this belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother before that. Each woman who used it was different. Some were born Apache, others came from different tribes. One was Mexican, but all learned to make it their own." Clara closed her fingers around the small stone, feeling its weight and warmth. "She says learning to belong somewhere new is like learning to grind corn," Takoda continued, translating the old woman's words. "At first your hands are clumsy and the corn is rough. But with patience and practice, both your hands and the corn learn to work together. Eventually, what seemed impossible becomes as natural as breathing." Grandmother Nayeli spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "She also says," Takoda added with what might have been amusement, "that you have good bones and strong spirit. The rest can be taught." Clara looked around the wickiup, taking in the woven patterns on the walls, the carefully arranged baskets, the small sacred objects she was only beginning to notice. Everything here had purpose and meaning, layers of significance that would take her years to understand fully. But for the first time since leaving Silver Creek, she felt something other than fear about the future. Maybe belonging wasn't something you were born with. Maybe it was something you could learn, like grinding corn or speaking a new language. "Will you teach me?" she asked Grandmother Nayeli, even though she knew the woman couldn't understand her words. But Grandmother Nayeli smiled and reached out to touch Clara's face. And somehow Clara knew her question had been answered. Outside, the mountain night wrapped around the camp like a protective blanket, and Clara fell asleep to the sound of distant drums and the gentle breathing of the woman who had decided to make her Apache. Clara woke to the sound of women's voices and the rhythmic grinding of corn. Sunlight filtered through the wickiup's woven walls, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across her sleeping mat. For a moment, she forgot where she was and reached instinctively for hope, her fingers closing around the familiar softness of her doll's worn fabric. Grandmother Nayeli was already awake, kneeling beside her metate, a large grinding stone working corn kernels into fine meal with his steady, practiced strokes. The old woman looked up when Clara stirred and spoke softly in Apache, her tone gentle and welcoming. "She says good morning," came Takoda's voice from the entrance. She asked if you slept well. Clara sat up, still marveling at the strange clothes she wore and the softness of her new moccasins. "I think so," she said honestly. "I dreamed about my mother, but they were good dreams." Takoda translated her words, and Grandmother Nayeli nodded with understanding. She gestured for Clara to come closer to the grinding stone and demonstrated the proper technique, how to hold the mano, the hand stone, how to apply just the right amount of pressure, how to work the corn in a rhythm that wouldn't tire her arms. Clara's first attempts were clumsy and inefficient. The corn kernels skittered away from her inexperienced hands, and what little meal she produced was coarse and uneven. But Grandmother Nayeli showed infinite patience, gently correcting Clara's grip and demonstrating the motion over and over until Clara began to understand. "Like this?" Clara asked, trying to copy the smooth, circular motion she'd observed. Grandmother Nayeli smiled and nodded encouragingly, then said something in Apache that made Takoda chuckle. "She says you learn like a young hawk eager, but not yet graceful. But hawks become the finest hunters with practice." Over the following days, Clara's world expanded beyond the walls of Grandmother Nayeli's wickiup. The old woman took her through the camp, introducing her to the daily rhythms of Apache life. Clara learned to identify the different types of baskets by their weaving patterns, each designed for specific purposes, some for gathering, others for cooking, still others for storing water or precious objects. She watched women prepare food. She'd never imagined turning desert plants into nourishing meals through knowledge passed down through generations. Agave hearts were roasted in earth ovens until they became sweet and tender. Mesquite pods were ground into flour that added nutty sweetness to bread. Prickly pear fruits were transformed into syrup and dried cakes that would sustain the people through winter. "How do you know which plants are good to eat?" Clara asked Takoda during one of their daily lessons. "My people have lived with these plants for countless generations," he replied. "Each mother teaches her children, and they teach theirs. The knowledge lives in our blood and bones." Clara found herself drawn particularly to the children of the camp, though they remained wary of her at first. Apache children her age seemed to possess skills and knowledge that amazed her. They could track rabbits through rocks where she saw no sign of passage, identify edible plants by their leaves alone, and move through the forest so quietly they seemed to become part of the landscape itself. But gradually, their curiosity overcame their suspicion. One morning, a girl about Clara's age approached Grandmother Nayeli's wickiup and spoke shyly to the old woman. After a brief conversation, Grandmother Nayeli gestured for Clara to follow the girl. Her name was Itzel, the same name as Takoda's deceased wife. Clara learned later, and she had volunteered to teach Clara some of the games Apache children played. They started with simple string figures, intricate patterns created with loops of sinew that told stories or represented animals and natural phenomena. Clara's fingers felt clumsy compared to Itzel's nimble movements, but the Apache girl showed remarkable patience. She would create a pattern, then carefully show Clara each step, repeating the lesson until Clara could manage a passable version. "What does this one mean?" Clara asked, holding up a complex figure that resembled a spider's web. Itzel spoke in Apache, then looked frustrated by the language barrier. She pointed to the sky, then made a sweeping gesture with her hands, clearly trying to communicate something important. Takoda appeared at that moment, returning from his daily hunt. "She's showing you the story of Spider Grandmother," he translated. "In our beliefs, Spider Grandmother taught the people to weave. That pattern represents her gift to our ancestors." Clara looked at the string figure with new respect. It wasn't just a game, it was a story, a lesson. A connection to something larger than herself. As the weeks passed, Clara's Apache vocabulary grew steadily. Grandmother Nayeli proved to be a patient teacher, pointing to objects and repeating their names until Clara could pronounce them correctly. Simple concepts came first: words for food, family relationships, daily activities. But gradually, Clara began to grasp more complex ideas. The breakthrough came one evening as she sat with Grandmother Nayeli, helping to prepare herbs for medicine. The old woman was explaining the properties of different plants, and suddenly, Clara realized she was understanding complete sentences, not just individual words. "The white sage purifies," Grandmother Nayeli was saying in Apache. "When burned, it carries prayers to the spirits and cleanses bad thoughts from the mind." Clara's eyes widened as the meaning became clear. "I understand you," she said in Apache, her pronunciation careful but comprehensible. Grandmother Nayeli's face lit up with joy and pride. She called out to the other women nearby, announcing Clara's progress, and soon a small crowd had gathered to witness this milestone. That night, Takoda found Clara practicing her new language skills with hope, speaking softly to her doll in Apache as she had once done in English. "You're learning quickly," he observed, settling beside her near the fire. "Grandmother Nayeli is a good teacher," Clara replied, still in Apache. "She makes everything seem possible." Takoda was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "She lost her own granddaughter 2 years ago," he said finally. "A fever took her in the winter. Teaching you helps heal the empty place in her heart." Clara looked toward the wickiup where Grandmother Nayeli was preparing for sleep. She thought about all the patience the old woman had shown, all the gentle corrections and encouraging smiles, and suddenly understood that their relationship was healing them both. "She's teaching me to belong here," Clara said softly. "Yes," Takoda agreed. "And you're teaching her to hope again." The moccasins Grandmother Nayeli had made for her were wearing thin from daily use, so Clara wasn't surprised when the old woman began crafting a new pair. But when they were finished, Clara gasped at their beauty. These moccasins were more elaborate than her first pair, decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns of blue and yellow that seemed to catch and hold the light. "These are not everyday shoes," Takoda explained when Clara tried them on. "These are for ceremonies, for special occasions. They mark you as truly one of us." Clara traced the beaded patterns with her finger, understanding the significance of the gift. She was no longer just a white child being sheltered by the Apache. She was becoming Apache herself, earning her place in the community through dedication and respect for their ways. That evening, as the camp gathered for the evening meal, Clara walked proudly in her ceremonial moccasins, her head high and her heart full of belonging she'd never known was possible. The wanted poster arrived on a cold morning in late October, carried by a Mexican trader who came to the Apache camp seeking to exchange goods for silver and turquoise. Clara was helping Grandmother Nayeli sort medicinal herbs when she noticed the unusual tension that settled over the camp like a storm cloud. Men gathered in urgent clusters, their voices low and serious. Women called their children closer to the wickiups, and even the camp dogs seemed to sense the shift in mood, their ears pricked and alert. Takoda emerged from the group of men, his face grim as he approached Grandmother Nayeli's dwelling. In his hand, he carried a piece of paper that he unfolded carefully, as if it contained poison. Clara looked at the poster and felt her blood turn cold. The drawing was crude but recognizable. It showed Takoda's distinctive features, his long hair, the scar across his left cheek that she'd never asked about. Below the image, words in English and Spanish proclaimed a reward for his capture, dead or alive. "What does it say?" Grandmother Nayeli asked in Apache, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Takoda's voice was steady as he translated, but Clara caught the underlying tension. "The cavalry wants me for raids on supply wagons last spring. They're offering $500 for information leading to my capture." Clara's stomach dropped. $500 was a fortune in this territory, enough money to tempt even decent people into betrayal. But more troubling was the implication behind the poster's existence. "You didn't raid any wagons, did you?" she asked quietly. Takoda's dark eyes met hers. "No, but that doesn't matter to them. They need someone to blame, and a lone Apache makes a convenient target." Over the following days, Clara learned more about Takoda's story from the camp's storytellers. During the long evenings around the communal fire, the older warriors would speak of the time before, when the Apache roamed freely across their ancestral lands. They told of battles fought and lost, of families scattered to reservations or killed by disease and violence. Takoda's name came up often in these stories, but not as Clara had expected. Rather than the fearsome warrior she'd imagined, he was described as a peacemaker, someone who had tried to negotiate safe passage for his people, who had sought compromise where others called for war. "He spoke the white man's language better than most," explained Nanton, an elderly warrior whose own face bore the scars of many battles. "The chiefs sent him to the forts to arrange truces, to ask for winter camps where our children wouldn't starve. He believed words could accomplish what bullets could not." "What changed?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Nanton's expression darkened. "The soldiers came to his camp under a flag of truce. They said they wanted to talk about moving his band to better hunting grounds. Takoda was away, trying to negotiate grain for the winter. When he returned, the old man's voice trailed off, but Clara didn't need him to finish. She'd seen the pain in Takoda's eyes whenever he thought no one was watching. After that, Nanton continued, he stopped believing in words. He took his revenge on the men who killed his family, then disappeared into the mountains. Some say the grief spirits claimed him. Others believe he chose exile to spare the rest of us from the cavalry's anger." Clara thought about this as she went about her daily tasks. She watched Takoda teaching the camp's boys to track and hunt, saw his patience with the women who sought his advice about territorial movements, witnessed his gentle care of elderly camp members who needed assistance. This man bore no resemblance to the savage described in the wanted poster, but the poster's existence changed everything in the camp. Visitors were viewed with suspicion. Hunting parties stayed closer to home. The sense of security that had made Clara feel safe began to erode as everyone wondered if, and when the cavalry would come. The anxiety reached its peak when scouts reported increased military activity in the valleys below. Patrol routes that had remained stable for months were suddenly shifting, bringing blue-coated soldiers uncomfortably close to the hidden camp. Clara was practicing her weaving with Itzel when the commotion began. Shouts echoed from the camp's perimeter, and both girls looked up to see a lone figure stumbling up the mountain path. Even at a distance, Clara recognized the unsteady gait and ragged appearance. Her father had found them. He was drunker than Clara had ever seen him, which was saying something. His clothes were filthy and torn. His face bore several days' worth of beard, and he moved with the exaggerated care of someone barely maintaining his balance. But his eyes, when they fixed on Clara, burned with desperate intensity. "There she is," he called out in slurred English, pointing an unsteady finger in her direction. "There's my daughter. You can't keep her, she belongs to me." Apache warriors materialized from seemingly nowhere, surrounding the intruder with weapons ready. But they held their positions, waiting for direction from their leaders. Takoda appeared, his face a mask of controlled anger. Behind him came Nanton, and two other senior warriors, their expressions equally grim. "You are not welcome here," Takoda said in English, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. Clara's father swayed on his feet, but managed to remain upright. "Don't matter if I'm welcome. I come for what's mine. That girl," he pointed again, "at Clara, she's my blood. You got no right to her. I bought her fairly, Takoda replied. You took my silver and walked away. The transaction is complete. Transaction? Clara's father's voice rose shriek. She's my daughter, not some piece of property. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight. But I'm her father. And that counts for something. Clara found herself walking forward, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and old pain. She hadn't seen her father since that terrible day at the auction, and part of her had wondered if he ever thought about what he'd done. Looking at him now, she felt a strange detachment, as if she were observing a character in someone else's story. This ragged, desperate man bore little resemblance to the father she remembered from her early childhood, the one who had lifted her onto his shoulders and told her stories about brave pioneers in distant lands. "Hello, father," she said quietly in English, the words feeling strange on her tongue after weeks of speaking primarily Apache. He stared at her, taking in her Apache clothing, her beaded moccasins, the way she held herself with new confidence. "Look what they've done to you," he whispered. "My little girl, dressed up like a savage." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they hurt her feelings, but because they revealed how little her father understood about what had really happened to her. "They didn't do anything to me, father," she replied, her voice steadier. Then she felt, "They saved me. They gave me a home, a family, people who care whether I eat or sleep safely. They gave me everything you couldn't." Her father's face crumpled, and for a moment Clara saw a glimpse of genuine remorse beneath the alcohol and desperation. "I know I made mistakes," he said. "But you're still my blood, Clara. Come home with me. I'll do better this time, I promise." "Home?" Clara looked around the Apache camp, at the wickiups nestled among the oak trees, at grandmother Nayeli watching anxiously from her doorway, at Takoda standing protective but patient nearby. "I am home, father. This is where I belong now." The words hung in the mountain air like a pronouncement of independence. Clara felt the weight of her choice settling around her shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt right. Her father's expression shifted from pleading to angry. "You don't know what you're saying. They filled your head with their heathen ideas, turned you against your own kind. But blood calls to blood, Clara. You'll remember who you really are." "I know exactly who I am," Clara replied, and for the first time in her life, she meant it completely. Clara's father stayed in the camp for 3 days, sleeping off his drunken journey and making increasingly desperate attempts to convince her to return with him. The Apache warriors watched him constantly, but allowed him to remain as long as he caused no trouble. On the morning of the 4th day, he was gone. Clara felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness when she discovered his absence. Part of her had hoped for some kind of reconciliation, some acknowledgement from him that she'd found happiness and peace among the Apache. But a larger part was grateful to have the tension of his presence removed from her new life. "Where do you think he went?" she asked Takoda as they worked together to repair a section of wickiup wall that had been damaged by recent winds. "Back to Silver Creek, most likely," Takoda replied, testing the strength of a willow branch before weaving it into place, "or to whatever saloon will accept his last coins." Clara nodded, trying to push away the pang of guilt she felt at her father's departure. She'd made her choice, and it was the right choice. The Apache had given her everything her father couldn't: safety, belonging, purpose, love. She wouldn't let misplaced loyalty cloud her judgment. But that afternoon, as she helped grandmother Nayeli gather late-season acorns for winter storage, Clara noticed increased activity among the camp scouts. Men came and went with urgent messages, and she caught fragments of conversation that mentioned cavalry movements in the valley below. "Is something wrong?" she asked grandmother Nayeli in Apache. The old woman's face was troubled as she replied, "The soldiers are moving in patterns we don't understand. They seem to know things about our hunting grounds, our water sources. It concerns the war leaders. That evening, the mystery deepened when a breathless scout arrived with news that made every warrior in camp reach for his weapons. A large cavalry force was moving up the mountain, following trails that should have been impossible for outsiders to navigate. They were less than a day's march from the hidden camp. How could they know the way? Nanton demanded during the emergency council that convened immediately. These paths are known only to our people and a few trusted Mexican traders. Someone guided them, Takoda said grimly. Someone who knows our territory. The implications hung heavy in the mountain air. Every face in the council circle reflected the same terrible possibility, that one of their own had betrayed them. But Clara felt a different kind of dread creeping through her chest. Her father's sudden departure, his desperate need for money, his intimate knowledge of her location pieces began fitting together in her mind like fragments of a shattered pot. The white man who came for the girl, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. My father. He's been gone since yesterday morning. All eyes turned to her, and Clara saw her own fears reflected in their expressions. You think he would betray us? Grandmother Nayeli asked gently. Clara's throat felt tight as she answered. He sold me for $20. What would he do for $500? The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every gaze in the circle. She'd just accused her own father of leading soldiers to the people who had become her family, and the terrible thing was that she believed it completely. Takoda's voice was carefully controlled when he spoke. If this is true, we have very little time. The soldiers will reach us by tomorrow afternoon. We could run, suggested one of the younger warriors. Take the children and elders to the high caves, wait for the cavalry to pass, and abandon everything we've built here? Nanton shook his head. This camp has been our sanctuary for 3 years. The spirits of our ancestors rest in this soil. The spirits will understand, Takoda said firmly. The living must survive to honor the dead. As the council debated their options, Clara felt a crushing weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. Her father's betrayal was bad enough, but she was the reason he'd known where to find them. If she hadn't been here, the camp would still be safe. This is my fault, she said suddenly, interrupting the discussion. If I hadn't come here, if Takoda hadn't bought me. No. Takoda's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a knife. You didn't choose your father's weakness any more than you chose his cruelty. His actions are his own. Grandmother Nayeli reached over and took Clara's hand, squeezing it gently. A child is not responsible for her parents' choices, she said. In Apache, you have brought only good to this camp. Your father's betrayal doesn't change that. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her presence had put everyone she cared about in danger. As the council continued their urgent planning, she slipped away from the circle and walked to the edge of camp, where she could look down into the valley and try to process what was happening. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape below. Somewhere down there, soldiers were marching toward them, guided by a man who had traded his daughter's safety for whiskey money. The thought made Clara physically sick. You're not to blame for this. Clara turned to find Takoda approaching, his face gentle despite the crisis consuming the camp. Aren't I? She asked. If you hadn't saved me, if I hadn't brought my problems here, if I hadn't saved you, I would have remained a dead man walking through life without purpose. Takoda interrupted. You gave me a reason to live again, Clara. You gave me a daughter. To protect and love. That's a gift beyond price. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. Some gift. I brought danger to everyone who's been kind to me. Takoda knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm. Listen to me carefully. In Apache tradition, we believe that every person's path is guided by the spirits. They put us where we need to be, when we need to be there. You were meant to be here, with us. And whatever happens next, we'll face it together as a family. But the soldiers will find an empty camp if we're wise, Takoda finished. The council has decided. We leave before dawn, taking only what we can carry. The high country offers many places to hide until this passes. Clara nodded, understanding the necessity, but feeling heartbroken at the thought of abandoning the place that had become home. What about the wickiups, the grinding stones? All the things that can't be moved? Material possessions can be replaced, Takoda said. People cannot. Grandmother Naeli's knowledge lives in her mind, not in her baskets. The camp spirit lives in its people, not in its buildings. As they walked back toward the flickering fires, Clara tried to memorize every detail of the place that had transformed her from an unwanted child into a cherished daughter. Tomorrow they would be refugees again, but tonight they were still home. She spent her last evening in the camp, helping to pack essential supplies and saying goodbye to the places that had become sacred to her. The grinding stone where she'd learned to make cornmeal, the oak tree where she'd practiced weaving, the fire circle where she'd first understood that she could belong somewhere. But the hardest goodbye was to the person she'd been when she arrived, the frightened, broken child who believed herself unworthy of love. That girl was being left behind, along with everything else they couldn't carry, and Clara found she didn't regret the loss at all. By midnight, the Apache camp that had sheltered her transformation was silent and empty, its people melting into the high country like morning mist. Behind them, they left only cold ashes and the echo of prayers for safe journey. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, danger, and the test of whether the bonds forged in peace could survive the crucible of crisis. The Apache band moved through the pre-dawn darkness like shadows given form. Clara had never seen anything like their silent efficiency as they dismantled their lives and transformed from a settled community into a mobile force capable of vanishing into the wilderness. Within hours of the council's decision, every essential item had been sorted, packed, and distributed among those strong enough to carry them. The elderly and very young would ride the horses, while everyone else would travel on foot through terrain too rough for mounted pursuit. Clara found herself assigned to help grandmother Naeli, whose advanced age earned her a place on one of the precious horses, but whose spiritual leadership made her voice crucial in decisions about their route and destination. The old woman sat straight-backed on her mari, her medicine bundle secured carefully across her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the landscape ahead for signs of danger or shelter. "Where are we going?" Clara asked in Apache as they climbed higher into country she'd never seen before. "To the sacred caves," grandmother Naeli replied. "Places where our ancestors sheltered during the wars with Mexico. The soldiers cannot follow us there without violating treaties older than their nation." The band numbered 43 people, a mixture of warriors, women, children, and elders who represented all that remained of their particular Apache group. Other bands had already been forced onto reservations or scattered by military campaigns, leaving these survivors as guardians of traditions, stretching back countless generations. Clara had grown to know most of them over her months in the camp, but seeing them now as refugees rather than settled community members gave her a new perspective on their resilience. Children who had been playmates were now carrying loads that would challenge adults, moving with determination that spoke of inherited survival instincts. Women who had taught her domestic skills were now strategic planners, debating routes and resources with the tactical awareness of experienced campaigners. And the men, the warriors she'd seen as protectors of a peaceful camp, had transformed into something more dangerous. Their faces bore war paint for the first time since Clara's arrival. Traditional designs that connected them to ancestors who had fought Spanish conquistadors, Mexican armies, and now American cavalry. Takoda moved among them all like a general, preparing for battle, though Clara knew his war paint represented something deeper than tactical preparation. The red and black patterns across his cheeks and forehead with the same ones he'd worn when he took revenge for his first family's murder. Seeing them again meant he was ready to kill or die to protect what remained precious to him. "You're frightened," Grandmother Nayeli observed as they paused to rest the horses near a hidden spring. Clara nodded honestly. "I've never seen war before. At home in Silver Creek, we heard stories, but they always seemed like things that happened to other people. War is different when it comes for those you love," the old woman agreed. "But remember, child, we are not helpless victims. We are Apache. Our people have survived ice ages and conquests, droughts and diseases by adapting to whatever challenges the world sends us. This is just another test." As they climbed higher, the landscape became increasingly rugged and otherworldly. Massive red rock formations jutted from the mountainsides like ancient monuments, and hidden canyons wound through stone corridors that seemed designed by spirits rather than geological forces. The air grew thinner and colder, but also somehow purer, as if they were ascending towards sacred spaces that ordinary concerns couldn't touch by afternoon. They reached the cave system. Grandmother Nayeli had spoken of a network of connected chambers carved into a cliff face that offered both shelter and multiple escape routes. The cave showed evidence of long occupation, with fire-blackened walls and storage niches that spoke of previous refugees who had sought safety in these heights. "Our people used these caves during the time of the Bluecoats' grandfathers," Nanton explained as they settled into the largest chamber. "Spanish soldiers could never find the entrances, and Mexican cavalry gave up trying. Perhaps the American army will prove equally unable to reach us here." But even as the Apache arranged their temporary camp with practiced efficiency, scouts brought increasingly troubling reports. The cavalry force pursuing them was larger than expected, nearly 100 soldiers supported by Chiricahua, Apache scouts who knew the terrain as well as any traditional enemy. "They're following our trail with certainty," reported Chato, the band's best tracker. "No hesitation, no false turns. Someone is guiding them who knows exactly where we would go." The implications were clear and devastating. Clara's father had done more than simply reveal their camp's location. He'd apparently provided detailed information about Apache, escape routes, and sanctuary sites. How could he know so much? Itzel asked during the evening meal. The young Apache girl had become Clara's closest friend, and her confusion mirrored what everyone was feeling. Clara stared into the cave's small fire, trying to remember every conversation she'd ever had with her father about the Apache. "He worked in the mines," she said slowly. "He heard stories from other miners, from soldiers, from anyone who'd had contact with Apache lands. And he was always good at remembering details when he was sober." The terrible irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same intelligence that had once made her father a skilled miner was now being used to hunt down the people who had saved his daughter. That night, as the band huddled in the cave's protective darkness, Clara lay awake listening to the worried conversations of the adults. The situation was growing more desperate by the hour. The cavalry was too close, too well informed, and too numerous to fight directly. But the alternative, surrendering to reservation life, meant the death of everything that made them Apache. "We could split up," one warrior suggested. "Small groups, different directions. Some might escape. And abandon our elders? Our children?" Takoda's voice carried quiet anger. "We stay together or we fall together. Then we make our stand here," Nanton declared. "These caves have protected our people before. They will protect us again." But Grandmother Nayeli shook her head slowly. "The old protections may not be enough against new enemies. The spirits are telling me that this crisis requires a different kind of courage." "What kind of courage?" Clara found herself asking, though she hadn't meant to interrupt the adult conversation. The old woman's eyes found hers across the flickering firelight. "The courage to transform again as you transformed when you came. To us, Sometimes survival means becoming something new rather than preserving something old. Clara didn't understand what Grandmother Nayeli meant, but the words settled into her heart like seeds waiting for the right moment to sprout. The next morning brought news that ended all debate about their options. The cavalry had reached the base of the cliff and was setting up a siege camp. They clearly intended to wait out the Apache rather than risk casualties attempting to storm the caves. "How long can we hold out?" Clara asked Takoda as they surveyed. "They're dwindling supplies." 2 weeks, maybe 3, if we're careful with food and water," he replied grimly. "But winter is coming, and these caves are no place for children and elders when the snows begin." Clara looked around at the people who had become her family, seeing the strain and worry etched on every face. Little ones who should have been playing were huddled close to their mothers, sensing the adult anxiety even if they didn't understand its cause. Warriors who had seemed invincible in their home territory now faced the impossible mathematics of 43 Apache against 100 soldiers with unlimited supplies. "There has to be another way," she said, though she had no idea what that might be. "Perhaps there is," Grandmother Nayeli said quietly. She'd been sitting in meditation since dawn, consulting the spirit world for guidance that wasn't coming through normal human channels. But it would require great sacrifice from someone who belongs to both worlds. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach as the old woman's gaze fixed on her. "What do you mean?" "You could go to them," Grandmother Nayeli said simply. "To the soldiers. You could speak for us in their language, with their understanding. You could be a bridge between two peoples who have forgotten how to see each other as human." The suggestion hit the cave like a physical blow. Several warriors immediately voiced objections, pointing out the obvious dangers of sending a child into an enemy camp. But Takoda remained silent, his face thoughtful as he considered the possibility. "They wouldn't harm a white child," Grandmother Nayeli continued, "especially one who can tell them that we mean no threat, that we only want to live in peace in places too remote to matter to their expansion." "And if they don't listen?" Takoda asked quietly. "Then we will have tried the path of wisdom before we choose the path of war," the old woman replied. "But I believe this child carries medicine strong enough to heal old wounds. She has already healed ours." Clara felt the weight of every gaze in the cave pressing down on her. The idea of walking into the cavalry camp terrified her more than anything she'd ever contemplated. But the alternative, watching her Apache family slowly starve in these caves or die fighting hopeless odds, seemed infinitely worse. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll go talk to them." "No." Takoda's response was immediate and final. "I won't send a child to face grown men's violence. If someone goes, it should be me, and give them exactly what they want," Clara countered, surprising herself with her boldness. "You're worth $500 to them, remember? But I'm just a white girl who got lost in Apache country. They'll have to listen to me." "She's right," Nen said reluctantly. "A child poses no threat. They might hear words from her that they would never accept from a warrior." The debate continued through the morning, but Clara had already made her decision. As the adults argued tactics and risks, she quietly gathered the items she would need for her mission. Her old dress from Silver Creek, carefully preserved by Grandmother Nayeli. Her original shoes worn but still recognizable as white clothing. Most importantly, Hope, the doll that connected her to her past and might help convince the soldiers of her authenticity. When Takoda realized what she was doing, his face went pale with understanding and fear. "Clara, no. I can't let you. You didn't let me choose anything else in my life," she interrupted gently. "Let me choose this. Let me save my family the way you saved me." The pain in his eyes nearly broke her resolve, but Clara forced herself to continue changing clothes, transforming herself back into the white child she had once been. When she was finished, she looked like a stranger to herself, pale and small and utterly out of place in the Apache cave. But she felt more Apache than ever, carrying the strength and wisdom her adopted people had given her into what might be the most important conversation of all their lives. "When you speak to them," Grandmother Nayeli said, pressing a small medicine bundle into Clara's hands, "remember that you carry the voice of all Apache people who only want to live with dignity. Help them see us as we really are." Clara nodded, tucking the bundle into her dress pocket. As she prepared to leave the cave that had become their fortress, she felt the transformation Grandmother Nayeli had spoken of beginning within her. She was no longer just Clara Mackenzie or just an adopted Apache child. She was becoming something new, a bridge between worlds that desperately needed to understand each other. The path down to the cavalry camp stretched ahead of her like a journey into the unknown. But Clara walked it with the confidence of someone who finally understood her true purpose. Clara's descent from the sacred caves felt like traveling between two different worlds with each step. Behind her lay the Apache realm of stone and spirit, where every rock formation held meaning and every wind carried messages from ancestors. Ahead waited the geometric precision of military organization, where men in identical uniforms followed orders that brooked no deviation or discussion. The cavalry camp sprawled across the valley floor like a blue and brown checkerboard. It's neat. Rows of tents and supply wagons forming perfect lines that imposed human order on the wild landscape. Sentries paced measured routes around the perimeter, their rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun, while horses stood tethered in orderly groups that spoke of military discipline rather than natural herd behavior. As Clara approached the outer pickets, she could see soldiers pointing at her unusual appearance. A white child emerging alone from Apache territory was clearly not something their training had prepared them to handle. She watched conversations ripple through the camp as word of her approach spread from sentry to sergeant to officer. By the time she reached the edge of camp, a small crowd had gathered to stare at the girl who seemed to materialize from nowhere. Clara tried to project calm confidence, but her heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. "Hold there, miss," called a sergeant with weather-beaten features and kind eyes. "Don't come any closer until we figure out what's what." Clara stopped obediently, holding her ragged doll against her chest like a talisman. "My name is Clara Mackenzie," she said clearly, using the English pronunciation she hadn't spoken in months. "I need to talk to whoever's in charge." "Mackenzie?" The sergeant's eyebrows rose with recognition. "You wouldn't be Tom Mackenzie's girl, would you? The one that got sold to the Apache a few months back." "Yes, sir," Clara replied, though the words felt strange in her mouth. Was she still Tom Mackenzie's daughter? Or had she become something else entirely during her transformation? The sergeant studied her carefully, taking in her white dress and shoes, the way she held herself, the doll that marked her as clearly non-threatening. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Begging your pardon, miss, but we heard you were taken by hostiles. How'd you get away?" "I didn't get away," Clara said simply. "I came to talk, to try to stop people from getting hurt." This answer seemed to confuse the sergeant more than reassure him. He exchanged glances with his men, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. Finally, he gestured toward the largest tent in the camp center. "Colonel Morrison's going to want to hear this himself," he decided. "Come along, but keep your hands where we can see them. No sudden movements." Clara followed the sergeant through the camp, acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments following their progress. Some soldiers looked at her with curiosity, others with suspicion, and a few with the kind of pity reserved for victims of unimaginable trauma. She caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Poor little thing, probably half mad from what they'd done to her. "Look how thin she is, must have been starving her. Amazing she survived at all among those savages." The comments stung, not because they hurt her feelings, but because they revealed how completely these men misunderstood the Apache people who had saved her life. How could she make them see that her months in the mountains had been the happiest of her entire existence? Colonel Morrison's tent was larger and more elaborately furnished than Clara had expected. Maps covered a folding table, marked with red. Pins that she assumed indicated Apache positions and movements. The colonel himself was a man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much frontier violence. "So you're the Mackenzie girl," he said without preamble. "Your father told us you'd been captured by hostiles. He seemed quite concerned about your welfare." Clara bit back her first response, which would have revealed exactly what she thought of her father's sudden concern for her welfare. Instead, she tried to project the innocence and gratitude these men would expect from a rescued captive. "Yes, sir. My name is Clara." "Well, Clara, you're safe now. We'll have you back to Silver Creek before you know it." The colonel's voice carried the forced cheerfulness adults used when talking to traumatized children. "But first, I need you to tell me everything you can about the Apache band that took you. How many warriors? What kind of weapons? Any information that might help us rescue any other captives they might be holding." This was the moment Clara had dreaded, the point where she would have to choose between protecting her Apache family and maintaining her cover as a grateful rescue victim. She took a deep breath and made her choice. "Colonel Morrison, I need to tell you something important. I wasn't captured by the Apache. I was saved by them." The colonel's friendly expression faded into something harder and more suspicious. "I'm not sure I understand, young lady." "My father sold me at auction in Silver Creek," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the truth. "Nobody wanted to bid on me except for one Apache warrior named Takoda. He paid $20 for me when nobody else would offer $5. He took me to his people, and they fed me and clothed me and treated me like family." "That's impossible," Morrison said flatly. "Apache don't adopt white children." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but Clara could guess what he'd been about to say. "They what, sir? Kill them? Torture them? Is that what you believe?" The colonel's face reddened at being challenged by a child. "I've been fighting Apache for 15 years, miss. I know what they're capable of." "Then you know they're capable of kindness and mercy, because that's all they've ever shown me," Clara replied. "The people you're hunting aren't raiders or killers. They're families with children and grandparents who just want to live in peace in the mountains. Your father says otherwise. He told us about raids on supply wagons, stolen cattle, attacks on isolated homesteads." Clara felt a flash of anger at her father's lies, but she forced herself to remain calm. "My father says whatever he thinks will get him his next drink, Colonel. He sold his own daughter for $20. Why would you trust anything else he tells you?" The words hit their target. Morrison's expression shifted as he processed this information, clearly reconsidering his assessment of his primary informant's reliability. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said finally, "these Apache are still in violation of federal orders. They belong on the reservation with the rest of their people. And if they refuse to go?" Morrison's silence was answer enough. Clara reached into her pocket and withdrew grandmother Nayeli's medicine bundle, placing it carefully on the colonel's map table. "The Apache leader, an old woman named Grandmother Nayeli, sent this to you. It's a peace offering. She wants to talk, to find a way for her people to live without causing trouble for yours." The colonel stared at the small leather pouch as if it might explode. "I can't negotiate with hostile Indians, miss. My orders are clear." "Then change your orders," Clara said with desperate urgency. "You have that authority, don't you? You could find a way to let them stay in the high country where they're not bothering anyone. And if I refuse?" Clara met his eyes steadily. "Then you'll have to kill them all, including the children and elders, because they won't surrender and they won't run anymore. They'd rather die free than live as prisoners." The stark honesty of her words seemed to impact Morrison more than any tactical briefing could have. For the first time since entering his tent, Clara saw uncertainty in the career soldier's expression. "You really care about these people, don't you?" he asked quietly. "They're my family," Clara replied simply. "They saved my life in every way that matters. And now I'm trying to save theirs." Colonel Morrison was still contemplating Clara's words when a commotion outside his tent interrupted their conversation. Voices rose in argument, and Clara heard the unmistakable sound of her father's drunken speech cutting through the military protocol. "That's my daughter in there. I got a right to see her." Morrison's expression hardened as he recognized the voice. "Sergeant Williams, escort Mr. Mackenzie to my tent. It seems we need to have a more complete conversation about this situation." Clara's stomach clenched as her father stumbled through the tent entrance, supported by two soldiers who were clearly trying to keep him upright. He looked worse then. She remembered, his clothes more ragged, his face more ravaged by alcohol, his eyes more desperate and wild. "Clara!" he called out when he saw her, lurching forward before the soldiers could stop him. "My baby girl! Look what those savages did to you." Clara stepped backward instinctively, not from fear but from revulsion at the theatrical grief in his voice. "Hello, Father. Don't you worry, sweetheart. Papa's going to take you home now. We'll get you cleaned up, get you some proper clothes, help you forget all about this terrible time." "I don't want to forget," Clara said quietly. "And I'm not going home with you." Her father's performance faltered as her words registered. "Now, Clara, you're just confused. Those heathens filled your head with their poison, but you'll remember who you really are once you're back among civilized folk." "I know exactly who I am," Clara replied, her voice growing stronger. "The question is, do you remember who you are? Do you remember selling me like a piece of livestock? Do you remember walking away with your money while I stood on that platform, crying for you not to leave me?" The tent fell silent except for the sound of her father's labored breathing. Colonel Morrison watched the exchange with fascination, clearly, learning more about his informant's character than he'd expected. "I was drunk," her father said weakly. "I wasn't thinking straight. A man makes mistakes when he's grieving his wife, when he's got no money and no hope." "You were drunk yesterday when you led these soldiers to the Apache camp," Clara countered. "You were drunk when you told them lies about raids and attacks. How many mistakes can you blame on whiskey before you have to accept responsibility for your choices?" Her father's face flushed with anger and shame. "You ungrateful little. Those Apache turned you against your own blood, your own father. My blood didn't feed me when I was hungry or hold me when I was scared," Clara shot back. "My blood sold me to the highest bidder and walked away counting coins. The Apache did what blood should do. They loved me." Colonel Morrison cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in his command tent. "Mr. Mackenzie, perhaps you could clarify some of the information you provided earlier about Apache activities in this region." Clara's father looked nervously between the colonel and his daughter, apparently realizing that his credibility was being questioned. "What do you mean?" "You reported raids on supply wagons, cattle theft, attacks on homesteads. My daughter here claims these allegations are false. She's just a child. She doesn't understand the bigger picture." "Then explain it to me," Morrison said patiently. "Give me specific dates, locations, witnesses. Help me understand this bigger picture." Clara watched her father's face cycle through confusion, panic, and desperate calculation. She could see him trying to construct lies that would support his earlier claims, but the whiskey had clouded his thinking too much for complex deception. "I heard things," he said finally. "Stories from other miners, from folks passing through Silver Creek. Maybe I got some details mixed up, but the threat is real." "What you heard," Morrison said with growing coldness, "was saloon gossip and frontier rumors. What you reported to me as fact was apparently fiction designed to earn a reward for information about Apache locations. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot. Clara's father's face went pale as he realized his position had become untenable. Now hold on, Colonel. I brought you right to them, didn't I? They're up there in those caves just like I said they'd be. After you sold your daughter to them and then betrayed their trust, Morrison replied. Mr. Mackenzie, you're not exactly establishing yourself as a reliable source. Clara saw her opportunity and took it. Colonel, my father isn't the only one. Here who knows the truth about these Apache. I lived with them for months. I can tell you exactly what kind of people they are, what they want, whether they pose any real threat to your settlers. Morrison turned his attention back to her, clearly intrigued by the possibility of getting accurate intelligence after discovering his informant's unreliability. Go on. They're not raiders, Clara said simply. They're refugees. The band-in. Those caves is all that's left of several groups that were scattered by previous military campaigns. They have 43 people, total warriors, women, children, elders. They grow or gather most of their food, and they only hunt on traditional lands that white settlers don't want anyway. And their leader? Grandmother Nayeli is the wisest person I've ever met. She's devoted her life to keeping Apache traditions alive and teaching children to respect the natural world. Takoda, the man who bought me, lost his first family to cavalry attacks. All he wants now is to protect what family he has left. Morrison studied Clara's face as she spoke, clearly weighing her words against everything he'd been told about Apache character and intentions. If what you're saying is true, he said slowly, then this entire campaign has been based on false information. Yes, sir, Clara replied, but it's not too late to fix it. You could be the colonel who chose peace over pointless bloodshed. The one who found a way for two peoples to coexist instead of destroying each other. Her father lurched forward again, desperation making him bold. Don't listen to her. She's been brainwashed by those savages. I'm her father. I know what's best for her. Clara turned to face him with calm certainty. You stopped being my father the day you sold me, Tom Mackenzie. These Apache became my family when they chose to love me instead of use me. There's a difference. The finality in her voice seemed to break something inside her father. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since entering the tent, Clara saw genuine grief in his eyes, not the performative sorrow he'd been displaying, but real regret for what he'd lost through his own choices. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Clara. I know I failed you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But you're still my little girl. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but her voice remained steady. I was your little girl. Now I'm an Apache daughter. And I'm going to make sure my Apache family survives this, with or without your help. She turned back to Colonel Morrison, who had been watching the exchange with something approaching respect. Colonel, I'm asking you to come with me to the caves. Meet Grandmother Nayeli yourself. See these dangerous Apache with your own eyes. Then decide whether they deserve to die for the crime of wanting to live free. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing military orders against moral uncertainty. Finally, he nodded slowly. Very well, Miss Mackenzie. You've earned the right to make your case. But I'll be bringing armed escort, and if this proves to be some kind of trap, it won't be. Clara interrupted. The Apache honor their word, even when others don't. As they prepared to leave the tent, Clara's father called out one last time. Clara, please, don't throw your life away for these people. Come home with me. I'll change. I promise. Clara paused at the tent entrance and looked back at the broken man who had given her life but never really loved her. I am home, she said simply. Finally. 6 months later, Clara stood at the edge of the Apache camp, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had become her permanent home. The settlement looked different, now larger, more established, with new wickiups arranged in family clusters. Around a central gathering area where the sacred fire burned continuously, the crisis that had driven them into the caves had ultimately transformed their situation for the better. Colonel Morrison's meeting with Grandmother Nayeli had gone exactly as Clara had hoped, with the old woman's dignity and wisdom converting the career soldier from adversary to advocate. Within a week of their first conversation, Morrison had recommended to his superiors that the Apache band be granted official permission to remain in their mountain sanctuary, far from settled areas where their presence might cause concern. The paperwork had taken months to process through military and territorial bureaucracy, but the outcome was everything Clara had dared to hope for. Their Apache family could remain in their chosen home, living according to their traditions while maintaining peaceful relations with the outside world. Clara had become an unofficial translator and liaison, helping to bridge the gap between Apache customs and federal requirements. Once a month, she rode down to Silver Creek with Takoda and 2 other warriors to meet with territorial officials, ensuring that both sides understood their mutual obligations under the new arrangement. These visits to her former home always felt strange, like traveling back in time to a place where she no longer quite belonged. The townspeople treated her with a mixture of curiosity and respect now, fascinated by her transformation but uncertain how to relate to someone who moved so easily between 2 worlds. Her father had died 3 weeks after their confrontation, in Colonel Morrison's tent, found one morning in the alley behind Silver Creek's main saloon. Doc Whitmore said his liver had finally given out, but Clara suspected he died of something deeper, the complete collapse of hope that came with realizing how thoroughly he destroyed everything that mattered. Clara had grieved for him, but not in the way she'd expected. She mourned the father he could have been, the love he might have given her if his own pain hadn't consumed him so completely. But she felt no guilt about her choices, no regret for refusing his last desperate attempts at reconciliation. Grandmother Nayeli had helped her understand that forgiveness didn't require forgetting, and that healing could occur even when relationships couldn't be repaired. Some people, the old woman had told her, are too broken to fix, but we can still love the memory of who they were before the breaking happened. Now, as Clara prepared for the morning's activities, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. She spoke Apache as fluently as English, moved through the mountain terrain with the silent grace of a born tracker, and could identify medicinal plants by their smell alone. Her hands bore the calluses of honest work grinding corn, weaving baskets, tanning hides, and her face had the healthy glow of someone who spent her days in clean mountain air. But the most profound change was internal. The frightened, unwanted child who had stood on that auction platform in Silver Creek was gone, replaced by a young woman who knew her own worth and understood her place in the world. Clara had learned that family wasn't about blood relationships, but about people who chose to love and support each other through good times and bad. Clara. Itzel's voice called from across the camp. Grandmother Nayeli wants to show you something. Clara smiled and jogged toward the old woman's wickiup, where she found Grandmother Nayeli kneeling beside a beautiful new basket decorated with patterns Clara had never seen before. "What do you think?" the old woman asked in Apache, gesturing toward her creation. Clara examined the basket closely, admiring the intricate design woven in colored grasses. The patterns seemed to tell a story. She could see representations of mountains, rivers, people traveling together, storms weathered, and sunshine shared. "It's beautiful," Clara said honestly, "but I don't recognize the pattern. Is it from an old tradition?" Grandmother Najili smiled mysteriously. "It's from a new tradition. I'm calling it the Bridgewalker pattern, in honor of someone who learned to walk between worlds and help others cross safely." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized the basket was meant for her, not just as a gift, but as a recognition of her unique role in the community. Bridge Walker, she repeated, softly, testing the Apache words on her tongue. It was a name that acknowledged both her origins and her transformation, honoring her journey while pointing toward her future. That evening, during the community's monthly storytelling circle, Grandmother Nayeli formally presented Clara with the basket and announced her new Apache name. The ceremony was simple but profound, with each member of the band offering a blessing or sharing a memory of how Clara had touched their lives. Takoda spoke last, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the daughter of his heart. "When I first saw you on that auction platform," he said, "I thought I was saving a lost child. I didn't understand that you were saving a lost man. You gave me a reason to live again, Clara. You gave me hope when I thought hope was dead forever." Clara rose from her place in the circle and embraced the man who had risked everything to give her a chance at happiness. "You gave me a family," she whispered in Apache. "You gave me a home. You gave me myself." Later that night, as the camp settled into peaceful sleep, Clara sat by the dying fire and carefully placed her old doll Hope into her new medicine bundle. The ragged toy that had once represented her only connection to love would now rest alongside. The sacred items that marked her as truly Apache, a grinding stone from Grandmother Nayeli, a feather from Takoda's first successful hunt after finding her, a piece of turquoise blessed by the camp's medicine man. The bundle told the story of her journey, from abandoned child to beloved daughter, from frightened captive to confident bridge builder between worlds. It honored both the little girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had witnessed her mother's death, her father's betrayal, and her own miraculous transformation. Clara whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever spirits had guided her to this moment, this place, this family that had taught her that belonging wasn't something you inherited, but something you earned through love, loyalty, and the courage to become your truest self. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were always more bridges to build between the Apache world and the white world, always more misunderstandings to heal and fears to address. But tonight, Clara was simply content to be exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who loved her not despite her complicated history, but because of how beautifully she had learned to transform pain into wisdom, loss into strength, and abandonment into the deepest kind of belonging. In the distance, a night bird called to its mate, and Clara smiled at the sound. She was home.